In the spring of 1754, a young officer crouched in the wet Pennsylvania forest and gave an order. The shots that followed killed a French diplomat. Within months, that skirmish had pulled in colonial militias, then professional armies, then navies. Within a few years, it had spread to Europe, the Caribbean, India, and the open ocean. By the time it ended, more than 1 million people were dead. The officer who lit the fuse was 21 years old. His name was George Washington. And to understand how one man in the woods helped start a global war, you have to understand the land he was standing on. By the middle of the 1700s, Britain and France had been circling each other in North America for decades. But one question had never been answered. Where exactly did British land end and French land begin? In the interior, nobody knew. British colonies were pushing west from the Atlantic. France held Canada in the north and a chain of positions running south toward the Mississippi. And between them lay a single, contested prize, the Ohio River Valley. Both empires claimed it. France needed it to link its northern and southern holdings. Virginia insisted it was theirs. Neither would let go. By 1753, French troops were moving in and digging in. So Virginia decided to push back, and the man they sent was a young, ambitious, largely untested militia officer. Remember that word, untested, because everything that follows turns on it. Virginia's lieutenant governor, Robert Dinwiddie, handed Washington a simple assignment: ride into the Ohio Valley and tell the French to leave. Washington made the journey. He delivered the message. The French said no. Their answer was just as blunt as the demand. This is French territory, and we're not leaving because Virginia asked us to. Washington rode back with that refusal. And here's where it could have ended: a rejected demand, a quiet retreat. Instead, Virginia doubled down. Washington was promoted and sent west a second time. And this time, diplomacy wasn't the only tool in his hands. If the French wouldn't leave, he could make them. But the French moved faster. As Washington marched, French forces seized the half-built British outpost at the forks of the Ohio and replaced it with something far stronger, Fort Duquesne. Just like that, France controlled the most important position in the entire valley. Washington pressed on anyway, a small column of colonial troops and native allies. Then his scouts found a French party camped nearby in the woods. What happened next lasted only minutes. Its consequences lasted years. Washington's men surrounded the French camp and struck fast. The fight was over almost as soon as it began. But then came the argument that would echo across an ocean. The French insisted the party had never come to fight. They said the men were carrying a diplomatic warning, messengers, not soldiers. If that was true, Washington hadn't won a battle. He'd attacked a diplomatic mission, and then it got worse. The wounded French commander, an officer named Jumonville, was taken alive. Standing beside Washington was Tanagrisson, a native leader with his own agenda. His people were caught between the two empires, and he had reasons to want the French and British locked in a war that neither could easily walk away from. As Jumonville lay wounded, Tanagrisson stepped forward and killed him. This was not a stray shot in the chaos of battle. It was deliberate, and it changed everything. Because now, whatever Washington had meant to do, the facts on the ground were undeniable. A French officer was dead, killed after the fighting had stopped. Retaliation wasn't a risk, it was a certainty. Washington pulled back and threw up a hasty defensive fort. He gave it a name that told you exactly how the campaign was going: Fort Necessity. The French came for him quickly. Troops poured out of Fort Duquesne, surrounded the little fort, and forced Washington to surrender. Added up, the French still held the valley. Their strongest fort stood untouched. Washington had lost his own position, and a French officer had been killed. A land dispute had just become a shooting war between two empires, and it was only getting started. News of the fighting crossed the ocean, and now London had a decision to make. Let France tighten its grip on the interior, or fight for it. Britain chose to fight. France sent reinforcements to match, and the war began to spread across the continent. For Britain, the early years were a disaster. Attack after attack in the interior failed. French forces seized key strongholds, including Fort Ticonderoga and Fort William Henry. In North America, colonists gave the conflict a name: the French and Indian War. But that name hides something important. This was never just Britain versus France. Native nations were not bystanders, and they were not simply allies of one side or the other. Nations like the Haudenosaunee, the Delaware, and many others made their own calculations, backing the French, the British, or neither, depending on who threatened their land and who might protect it. Tanna Grisson's killing of Jumonville was one version of that logic. There were dozens more. The Ohio Valley was the spark, but the fuel had been building for a very long time, and not only in America. By the late 1750s, the fighting in the forests of North America had merged into something enormous, the 7 Years' War. One by one, Europe's alliances dragged nation after nation into the conflict. Millions of soldiers mobilized, thousands of warships put to sea, armies clashed across Europe, Britain and France fought for control of India, naval battles raged across the oceans, the fighting reached the Caribbean and beyond. A confrontation that began in the American wilderness was now a world war, and that scale became France's greatest weakness. France could no longer pour everything into defending North America. It had a whole world to protect. Britain saw the opening and took it. The Royal Navy choked off France's ability to reinforce its troops across the Atlantic. Cut off and outnumbered, French positions began to fall. Fort Niagara fell. The great fortress of Louisbourg fell. And then came Quebec. With every defeat, France's hold on North America crumbled a little more. By 1760, New France surrendered. The war would grind on elsewhere for a few more years, but the fight for Canada and eastern North America was effectively over. Britain had won. The question was what that victory would cost. The 7 Years' War officially ended in 1763. The numbers were staggering. Some estimates put the global death and casualty toll as high as 1.4 million. The North American fighting was only a fraction of it. Britain came out of the war stronger than ever. For nearly a century, it had struggled against France for the continent, and now French power in North America was shattered. But victory handed Britain a new problem. The empire was bigger. Defending it was expensive, and the war had left the British treasury deep in debt. So London turned to the colonies for money and for tighter control. The colonists saw it completely differently. They had bled in that war, too. Many believed beating France should have opened the West to them, not closed it. Instead, the relationship began to rot. Arguments over territory became arguments over taxes. Arguments over taxes became arguments over representation. And in little more than a decade, Britain would be at war in North America again. Only this time, the enemy wouldn't be France. It would be its own colonies. And the man chosen to lead those colonies? George Washington. The same young officer who once rode into the Ohio Valley on behalf of the British Crown would one day command an army fighting to destroy British authority in America. Washington didn't invent the rivalry between Britain and France. Those empires had been fighting long before he was born. But in 1754, he stepped onto one of the most dangerous fault lines on Earth. A disputed valley, two empires, native nations fighting for their own survival, a diplomat killed, a fort surrendered, then reinforcements, then armies, then fleets, then a war that spanned the world. The young man sent to move a few soldiers out of a forest had walked straight into history. At the exact moment, a local quarrel became a global war, and he was just getting started.